I was born in Carroll, Michigan. Michigan, is shaped like a mitten, and I was born right about here in the thumb in Tuscola County, Carroll, Michigan.
Were you born in a hospital?
I was. My mother, I understood from what she told me later, was that she was pretty miserable because she'd gone over 9 months, and then she realized why, because I weighed 9 pounds, 13 ounces. I was a big baby girl, and I was her third child. Oh, Wilaine. Yes, that's a very unusual name. My mother's father was named Willard, and she took the WIL from Willard, and one of his sisters was named Elaine, so she took the AINE from Elaine and named me Wilaine. Very unusual name. At that time, still is. Vera was a favorite cousin of my father's, so Wilaine Vera Kaufman.
Do you have a memory, like a very fond memory from being very, very, very young?
Well, I remember one thing vividly was how my dad one day said he was going to order a new house for us from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And so he brought the catalog home, and we looked through it, and we decided on one of the houses. And then we all went together to Saginaw, Michigan, about 30 miles away, and we picked out the house that he could order. So the cost of the house was $4,100. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house, and it's still standing there today. It's a beautiful home. And several weeks later, the conductor of the train station called us and said, "Your house is here. Kaufman, your house is here." So we all went down to the station, and we looked up at this great big train, and the conductor said, "Your house is on the last 2 boxcars." And so they loaded that all up in trucks. Each piece of lumber was numbered. There were 30,000 pieces that it took to build that house, and it took 6 weeks to put it together. And then we had our new house, and we moved there, and we had a beautiful backyard. I remember the three of us older children, because there was my brother Robert first. He was 6.5 years older, and then Joyce, she was 2.5 years older, and then I was born. And 8 years later, my brother Keith was born. So the 3 oldest children played in this beautiful backyard. We had teeter-totters, swings, a tree that we could climb, a rock garden, beautiful rock garden. So that's where we played.
Do you remember how old you were when you moved into the house?
When they built the house, it was actually before Keith was born. So I was probably 5.
So that's where you grew up.
That's where I grew up.
What street was that on?
West Frank Street, 833 West Frank Street. And the people across the street had children our age, and they had a lot next door to them where our parents got together and made a baseball diamond. So we played baseball a lot. For some reason, they made me be catcher. And that's how I got a broken nose, being catcher, being hit by a bat. Back in those days, back in the 30s, we didn't have cell phones, or we had one telephone at our house. So it was basically whoever we saw right in our own neighborhood that we played with.
Did you have any pets growing up?
Yes, we had dogs. I had a dog named Jack. We always had dogs and cats. And the difference was the dogs and cats lived outside. They came in at night to sleep, but basically they were outdoor pets.
Do you remember any favorite foods you had as a child? Favorite meals?
Well, my dad owned a supermarket, and so we always had the best foods. And my mother canned in the summer. We had a place in the basement that had all of her canning things. She canned like peaches and pears in the summer. It was always had the smell of great fruits that she was canning. Corn, vegetables, she canned too. We didn't freeze things in those days because we had an ice box that had maybe room enough for ice cubes, but
Wow, so you would get a big block of ice, like like the milkman?
a long time ago, the Iceman Comet, and he would bring a big chunk of ice he'd hold them together by the tongs and put it in the ice box. And when that was melted, he'd bring a new one. Our furnace was first a wood furnace, and I have a picture in my baby book of Herbie, my next door neighbor, and Mother opened the basement window, and we were tossing the split wood down through the window into the basement. They had dropped it out on the yard. They drop it down. After that, we had a coal furnace, and they dumped coal, and then my dad would go down in the morning and shovel the coal from the pile in the basement into the furnace.
I'm sure a lot during the winter.
Yes, keep it warm.
Growing up as a child in Michigan, especially in the winter, did you play winter sports or do winter activities?
We ice skated. We had a fairgrounds in Carroll, and that was great because they always flooded a big area, and sometimes I would go all by myself, take my ice skates, walk down, we walked everywhere, of course, to the fairgrounds, and sit down, put my ice skates on and ice skate. I'd ice skate till dark, put my boots back on, and walk home. And I'm thinking, wow, I remember doing all of that, and we were safe, though. It was the big difference.
How big of a town was Carroll?
We had 3,000 people, and my dad had the first supermarket in the whole county. So that was a big occasion. I mean, people came from all over when he opened that store up. That meant we had an electric machine for people to check out, and Saturday was a big day in Carroll. All the stores were open, and the farmers, it was a big farming area around Carroll. Farmers all came to town. They'd dress up, and their wives would dress up, and they'd come in and shop with Mr. Kaufman. Sometimes they'd bring crates of eggs, and then we all worked at the store at different times. Sometimes he'd have me down there on Saturday to do. The farmers would bring in big crates of eggs, and he'd send me out in the back room, and I put them in boxes, a dozen a box.
Did you all the children work for Dad? Your dad?
All of us worked at the store. We learned all about facing the shelves, about putting the new cans at the back. The first way we marked well, first of all, we had freight day. The truck came once a week, and they unloaded the freight. They put it on carts and the boxes, and then they brought it out. And I was too little to lift any of that, but I like to do the fruit, cans of fruit, and then cans of vegetables. And then when I first started doing it, I had a black marker pencil and marked the cans, like peaches, 69. I put 69. And then somebody thought of doing stamping. And then we started, and that was fun. Took a lot less time to stamp. And I remember back from the beginning, when I started working there, I always liked to decorate everything, make everything look prettier, bring things out to the front. And on Saturdays, which was the biggest day of the week for shoppers, Dad would let me display all the fruits and vegetables. And that's where I learned to bring things forward and make them look pretty. He used to come back and scold me. He said, "Wilaine, you're taking all this time. Gotta get it up there." Papa was that wasn't his first store. He started out with a small store, he rented a building, and he started out with the company called Atlantic and Pacific, the AMP, which was in business along with Kroger at one time. And when the freight would come in, it was so small, so cereal had to go on the top shelf, and we had these we put clampers to lift them up to the top shelf, and then when someone would come in and shop, you'd have to take it down. And my dad did a lot of credit with people. He was well known throughout the county that he would never let anybody go hungry, or if they didn't have enough money that week, he would give them credit. And he kept a little ledger he put cereal for 40 cents and milk down. And then their name would go on the top, and he put them in a file box. And so because there was the Great Depression in the 30s when I was born, I don't remember too much of that because we always had food. And my dad had, as I said, had this great reputation of nobody went hungry in that county. My dad some farmers would go all winter without being able to pay him.
It's a little different than a credit card, but it's a similar concept.
Yeah, he was the original credit card.
So I read a little bit of Mimi and Papa's book that Tim and Wendy have, and he mentions two people. I want to know if you happen to remember their names or have heard of them from working at the store. Iva Van Vliet and Mildred Downing.
Okay, Iva Van Vliet and Mildred Downing both worked for my dad for years, and they were very faithful. They just did checking out. And when people would come up to the store, when you bought coffee in those days, it were whole beans, and people would bring their coffee up, and then the grinder was there, and the checkout lady would pour the coffee in. But both of them were wonderful ladies that my dad could depend on, and they worked for him almost up until they died.
Can you tell me about your siblings?
Robert was the oldest, and he was about 8 years older than I. And he always worked for my dad. And when he got older, so then in the meantime, we went through World War II, and there wasn't meat available. Meat was very scarce, and my dad, in order to keep Robert in the store, he gave him the whole meat department. That's meat, cheese, all the things that you see in the meat department. And he ran that, and he hired 2 full-time people to help him. I remember Farmer Pete's was the big meat. They didn't produce meat, but they brought it, and they'd bring meat to the store, half a cow. They would carry in, hanging on a hook in the back of the meat place, and then they'd bring it out a little at a time and cut it up. They were always cutting up. Meat didn't arrive in those days at the store cut up. They brought it out to the chopping block and cut it up.
Nice. Okay.
And then Joyce was 2.5 years older, and so she worked in the store too. And then of course Keith was born 8 years after I was, and he worked for my dad. We all worked for him. But I remember doing so many things with my dad growing up. He would take me out hunting with him. He took me deer hunting, and he told me to climb up in the tree, and he said, climb up this tree and just stay there and be real quiet. And you watch for deer. And I remember going deer hunting. At pheasant hunting, someone would loan my dad their hunting dog, and we'd go out in a field, farmer's field, that the farmer had said we could use. And he'd let the dog loose. The dog would run through the corn shocks and scare up the pheasants, and then my dad would shoot them, take them home, and clean the bird, and we'd have it for dinner. And he took me ice fishing at Caseville. We'd go up in the morning. This was the dead of winter. It seems like our winters were colder then and longer, but somehow he would know when the ice was thick enough to drive on, and he'd drive way out on the ice, stop the car, we'd get out, and I brought my ice skates, so I ice skate on out further. This was all right in front of where our cottage is now. And then he'd chop a hole in the ice, and we'd sit there and fish. He'd catch perch. And he'd have his own shanty with his name on out there in the middle of this big thing. So one day I said, Dad, how, you just leave your shanty out here. What happens when the ice melts? He said, oh, eventually it'll float into shore, and my telephone's number on it his telephone number was 321. Somebody will call me, and I'll find somebody to go up and take it back, pull it back on the shore. That's the way my dad was. And he loved to fish. He took Julie and Lisa out fishing. He took everybody fishing, during the summer. He would sit there all day, and everybody, to this day, people still talk about my dad and how he loved to fish.